Hi everyone, welcome to the Absolute Units podcast. I'm Ollie Douglas, curator of the Museum of English Rural Life.
And I'm Joe Vaughan, the museum's social media person.
This is the first of 4 episodes, which we've recorded with the amazing help of the fantastic students of the Film, Theatre and Television Department of the University of Reading.
This podcast is co-hosted by Ollie and our colleague Katie Bergen. And once we've completed these first 4 episodes, we're planning to continue with regular programming moving forward. We would love your feedback for shaping the future of the podcast. And so if you have any suggestions, thoughts, amazing ideas, please fill out the survey in the episode description.
Yeah, so don't just follow us like sheep. Treat us like you're the shepherds and we're the flock.
Or we're both shepherds.
True.
We're both shepherds.
I always wanted to be a shepherd.
Well, you are a farmer's son, aren't you?
I am a farmer's son, a sheep farmer's son, in fact.
Do you want to touch on that very quickly so people know more about you?
I'm a sheep farmer's son. Yeah, I'm a sheep farmer's son, and I guess I wanted to avoid having to go out into the cold and look after sheep and do farming things, and instead have ended up inside in a shed looking after a shed full of old farming things.
And the spirit of the podcast is we're just thrilled to be sharing more of the amazing stories from our collection with you wherever you are in the world. So please sit back, enjoy, and here's the first ever episode of Absolute Units.
Hello, welcome to the Absolute Units podcast from the Museum of English Rural Life. We're exploring the fascinating, bizarre, and even moving backstories of our artifacts and archives to tell the story of the English countryside. I'm Digital Engagement Officer Katie Bergen.
And I'm Merrill Curator, Dr. Ollie Douglas.
And this is our very first episode. So you might have discovered the Merle from a viral social media post that we made back in 2018, showing an unreasonably handsome and distinctive Exmoor ram with a Mona Lisa smile, captioned with the phrase, "Look at this absolute unit." For a behind-the-scenes look at the prehistory of the Merle's first viral moment, we're joined by Adam Koszary, freelance creative producer and digital strategist and reformed social media manager in the cultural heritage space, and creator of that original meme. Thank you so much for being here.
No worries. It's an absolute pleasure.
So, Adam, it's really great to have you here. This is a bit of a trip down memory lane for both of us, I suspect, and it's nice to be able to take Katie with us on that journey to remember how all of this kicked off in the first place. You first joined us, as I recall, very vaguely, because it was a long time ago, to help redevelop the museum ready for reopening. And I think we reopened in 2016, so it must have been a few years before that. Can you tell us maybe how digital started off becoming a key part of what you did way back then?
Oh God, yeah, that was a long time ago. I've had a baby, a dog. I've worked for a megalomaniac billionaire. It's been a wild ride since coming to Reading.
Yeah, and I'm still here.
Well, it was interesting because when I started, we were redeveloping the entire museum, weren't we? So it was blank slate, start from scratch, but trying to find more of the stories in the objects and in the countryside, because before that we were focused on his materials, wasn't it? It's like, here's the straw section. What's related to straw, yeah.
I can explain why.
I didn't realize it was like Three Little Pigs style, just like straw section, brick section.
Weird metal cage. It was
going back to the world of, there was a period in museum practice where we all paid attention to an educational theorist called George Hine, constructivism. And Hine's constructivism was that we all brought to museum displays pretty much, a whole load of subjective baggage, and therefore we took away from them probably not that much of what curators like me are trying to impart. So the museum had been constructed partly on a bit of a shoestring at the tail end of a big redevelopment project, an earlier one. And also, it was attempting to be constructivist. It was attempting to be quite light touch in the interpretation. So as Adam says, what we were trying to do with this revised version of the galleries was to interpret them more heavily, to lead people to hold their hand and give them some nice hooks to connect to. And part of what we did And we'll probably come back to this when we talk about those galleries again and again, but part of what we did was about people stories. So it was about drawing out those tiny little micro histories. And I remember one particular people story that ended up in the displays connected to something that was quite significant in terms of social media at the time, because it connected to a tweet, didn't it?
Yeah, and it's to go back to your question of why I fell into digital and doing social media. It was because we were uncovering all these different stories in the collection, doing all this research, but we couldn't open again for another, 2 years or something. And not all of those stories can get into the end galleries because you've only got so much physical space. We're bound by the physical world. But digital offered us an opportunity. I say digital. We had a blog and we had social media. It just offered that opportunity to tell more of those stories immediately and get them out into the world. And one of these stories was around this incredible carved walking stick in the collection. And I think I was drawn to it because so much of our collection is big threshing machines, tractors, very practical implements. And this is a practical thing as well because it's a walking stick for a shepherd. So you're out and about, you need it to get around. I don't know if they had it any of a practical purpose. It's not got a crook, like a classic shepherd's crook. This is something that was obviously lovingly carved into, varnished. It's basically a work of art. It's covered in, what would you describe it as, folk art?
Yeah, I guess so. I slightly worry about the term folk art, but definitely those kind of slightly naive sculptural forms on it that depict, I think, various animals and figures and a little bit of text as well. Can you remember the text?
Oh, I had this written down. I brought some notes. So
it says, carved by a poor shepherd.
Carved by a poor shepherd, but it's also got biblical quotations like, "Fear not, you would wish to die. The Lord hath given and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And beware of death."
Feels a bit like being back in that redevelopment project again, ominous threat of, you've got to get some galleries out there at the end of this. But yeah, so you shared nice images and content about this stick online, presumably through social media. Was it on Twitter or?
It must have been Twitter because that was what we were mainly using, I think.
Yeah. And what was the response?
Well, we had someone get in touch, which we were not expecting, who had basically the same walking stick, didn't they?
So the one in the Merle, the one in the collection that's now on display, so you can see it in the galleries. Well, it's quite difficult to see because it's much better online in some ways. You can see all of that detail. But the one in the galleries in the collection was carved by a shepherd called Henry Beecham, who was the cousin of Thomas Beecham, of Beecham's powders. So for any listeners who don't know, Beecham's powders were a kind of cold remedy that you can still buy today. And Thomas Beecham became a sort of big pharmaceutical giant, really.
He had a massive factory up in, was it Bury or Oldham?
Yeah.
Near Manchester, I think.
Yeah. So there's that connection to this pharmaceutical history, but also this connection to a sort of shepherding history. And the person who responded was another family member who had...
Yeah, it was a relative. So I think Henry Beecham? Henry Beecham, yeah. Who handily carved his name onto the stick. You can't usually rely on that for most objects. They just handily say, yeah, this was made by me at this date. They had inherited a very similar stick and got in touch and gave us a bit more of the background of the story, I think, which was that Henry Beecham had... Remind me of the name of the man who's actually founded the pharmaceutical
Thomas
company.
Beecham.
Thomas Beecham had come to visit Henry Beecham, I think it was his cousin, some sort of relation, and was helping around the farm with the shepherding. And that's where he first started adapting some of the sheep remedies they were using into the pills that would basically form the foundation of the business, I think.
Yeah, it's very forward thinking. It's what sort of people in the study of animal and human health call One Health today, a kind of unified, integrated, holistic understanding of health. But what was amazing about your Twitter banter about this object and your sort of accrual of interesting new contextual history was that this was the first time in the Merle's history, at least, that we had taken content from social media and added it to our paper documentation, because, museums like to be a bit old-fashioned. We keep bits of paper in folders and write down, every object that comes into the collections. We still write it down in an accession book. It's a bit old hat, but we like to do that. But that transition of social media material into the documentation was a kind of key moment for us.
It made it real, because before, I think people thought of social media as just marketing. And what the museum really did was separate to that it was about curating and visitors and objects. And this was the first time where social media wasn't just a marketing tool. It was something that actually, it's where people were and it's where their experiences were. It's where you could get their stories. And I know you're interested in pursuing this in future, because half of how people talk about the countryside, talk about their lives, talk about even material culture is as much online as getting in the old paper methods.
Definitely. And we're going to get into that a bit later, because it's really interesting thinking about the different communities online and how those relate to communities out there in the world. But Katie, is this interesting, taking us right the way back? Because actually, I mean, there are even some stories that take us back to when we got excited about things on socials going big on legacy media, which I think we'll get into in a second, actually.
Which I think is extremely funny and very touching and sweet, because to some of us, 2013 or 2016 does not feel like that long ago, but it really is truly a full decade. What's striking me about this conversation, though, is the idea that not only is social media part of museum work, but it's actually giving us more information about provenance. So it's connecting to people who, the idea that you would have a similar stick that looks like this is nuts to me, because this is deeply carved and detailed in the same way that the margins of my most hated math class notebook are, in the sense of you're so bored and you're sitting in the back of the field or homeroom or whatever, and you're just carving what you can think about. And what I think is beautiful about this is it's got all of these sort of knobs and knots that have been created and shaped into these beautiful sort of like organic forms. And also it's got like angsty teen metal quotes about God and life and work and stuff. But the idea that there could be something this seemingly unique that someone could see just like as a fluke on the internet and say, oh, I've got one of those, is wild. And I feel like that is really what changes the picture of what social media can do for museums and how it can sort of enhance the information that we have that we never would have gotten were it not for that tweet. But I do want to segue into the mousetrap just because it's gross and fun and weird. And if we don't talk about it here, I'm going to be sad, because I keep hearing stories about, oh, well, you've heard about the mousetrap and you know about the mouse. And I don't know about the mouse. So will one of you tell me about the mouse?
Okay. Well, I mean, you're talking about the wild. Obviously, on the walking stick, there are lots of carved animals. The connecting point being animals, and I think that's something quite significant. But the mousetrap, as I recall, and Adam may remember this differently, but I found a dead mouse in an Edwardian mousetrap, which was built to a Victorian design. I can go into the details about the mousetrap if you want.
It's got an amazing name, hasn't it?
Yeah.
The official name of it.
What was it? Was it the perpetual mouse?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. So this mousetrap, it was a sort of so-called humane mousetrap. So the mouse in it was supposed to be caught live, and then you would release it. But because I found this in the museum stores in a collection of mousetraps, and I was not expecting to find a dead mouse in there, I wrote a letter to our conservator, Fred, and I wrote an email, a letter. So in the email, I wrote, I found this mouse in the mousetrap. Is it supposed to be there? And I knew that this mousetrap collection had been from a mousetrap collector who I think had worked for a government quango of some sort who did work on pest management on farms. And I just wondered whether maybe he had a tiny little stuffed mouse in there as a kind of example. Sometimes people put those sorts of things in collections. So I wrote an email to Fred saying, is the mouse supposed to be there? And Fred wrote back to say it wasn't. And somehow you got hold of this email exchange, Adam. And I think you did fun things with it.
Well, I think I must have just been copied in. But I think as soon as I saw that email, I knew that this would land well with people. Because the drama of it.
Can I ask a rude question? How often do you find mice in around the collections? Is this something that happens with integrated pest management? Is this like a thing you were expecting?
You don't, and you shouldn't. And yeah, I mean, still to this day, we don't quite know how the mouse ended up there. I mean, I think we do know what the mouse was trying to do in there. because the poor little thing had chewed up the object label, and I think it was trying to make a nest.
Oh dear.
So
that's a tragedy.
Yeah.
I think that's why people connected with it, because just that confluence of events of a mouse getting into the museum, which it shouldn't be able to do, but we do have a garden outside. Managing to find, because there's how many objects are up there on this first floor of the museum? Thousands, tens of thousands of objects. And it found the one case, the one shelf dedicated to mousetraps, the most deadly shelf it could have found.
I mean, but it was
in the
designed
entire
for mice.
museum.
You can't blame the mouse. It was designed for mice.
Yeah.
That was for her.
And
It just went poorly.
But then managed to crawl inside one, and then that, just thinking of it dying alone in that trap is tear-jerking enough. But then just the fact that you found it mustn't have been dead for that long when you found it.
Yeah,
so fresh.
forensically, how dead was it? Because it
was very dead.
It wasn't.
I mean, it wasn't smelly because
Well, that's
I would have.
question.
Yeah. I mean, but
Yeah, we reacted pretty quickly, didn't we? We took some photos of it still in the mousetrap. There was a bit of a discussion about whether we should even tell people about this, because acknowledging that mice can get into your collection isn't usually the thing you shout about the most. But the story, I think, was so good that we couldn't not share it. And then someone else we knew online, I forgot his name, he works at the SS Great Britain now. He may have moved on. He put us in touch with a BuzzFeed journalist who then wrote an article about it. And again, that was the first time we realised, we can reach tons of people, because this isn't a story that just can do well just because it's from the British Museum. The story is strong enough by itself that everyone will enjoy it, no matter how small our museum is. And
yeah, but the brilliant thing about that was, and again, this is taking us way back when, is that it wasn't the fact that it went viral on BuzzFeed that got us all excited. It was the fact that we had Canadian radio journalists ringing us up and asking for interviews. I did a particularly stupid film piece for BBC South Today, where they came in and filmed the mouse eye view of the store as the mouse tried to get them. And then I had to demonstrate the mousetrap. I mean, that's out there somewhere. It's really embarrassing to think that. But it was that legacy media picking up on it that somehow reinforced the fact that this was a good thing. And I think there's something brilliant about being honest about the process as well. The fact that, that work that you did, Adam, opened up the behind the scenes stuff that was going on at a time when I think the museum was probably still shut to the public because we were redeveloping. So we didn't have other opportunities to share the stories. So it was,
Yeah. And then our conservator stuffed the mouse, and now you can see the mouse, the original dead mouse in the mousetrap in the big display case at the start of the museum.
Yeah. And I mean, again, connecting to that, really grounding it in the reality, we did in fact have letters from people for the ethical treatment of animals, connecting to the actual purpose of the mouse trap itself. We had contact with the original collector, all off the back of that viral moment. I think he was calling us out for having called it a Victorian trap when it was in fact an Edwardian example of a trap that had been originally designed in the Victorian period. So, getting our facts right and grounding us back in the need to be robust about the documentation. Yeah. So I've been looking back at a Tumblr that you wrote about the walking stick, Adam, and I can see that you mentioned wolves and lions and cats in amongst the creatures carved onto it. And then we got the mouse, and then there was a moment with ducks and something to do with a bat, and all of that connects through to what became an absolute unit of a Dorset horn ram. What is it about animals that runs right the way through all of this?
I think everyone just loves animals. And I think the thing Mel struggled with always was, how do you get people interested in a place called the Museum of English Rural Life, which does not immediately scream, I'm going to have a great time here.
Yeah, it's pretty rough.
I always thought we should have been called the Countryside Museum or something, because it's just And then people would be disappointed because they'd arrive and it's in the middle of a town.
Yeah,
They get very confused.
the Council for the Preservation of Rural England, or Protection of Rural England, whichever they used to be, both I think, have finally woken up to the fact that the countryside charity sings a little bit more. So maybe you're right.
But if we've had over conversations before, I know, about how the museum is not just about animals. It's about the whole countryside. It's got people in it. It's got folklore, arts, science, technology, and everything. But that's still quite difficult to tell the story of online. But animals, you can project whatever you want onto them. They're not blank slates, but they're not as problematic as other topics that you can explore. So if you're presenting something in the way that we presented the sheep, almost uncritically, just like, look how big and impressive this thing is. And it's immediately obvious. You're like, yes. You don't have to worry if whether they send a racist tweet that you don't know about, or they're going to turn into like a failed celebrity that just destroys their legacy. Sheep are just impressive and they eat their grass, and everyone can be on board with that. It's a great leveler. But that doesn't stop us from making that story a little bit more complex as you dig into it.
Yeah. Well, I'm a sheep farmer's son, so I could bang on about the details of sheep farming, but that's not why we're here today. I think maybe, and this may be total madness of me, but I think maybe we should perhaps describe the absolute unit tweet and what it was for the purposes of those who may not have encountered it.
There could be one person listening to this podcast, and I am talking about my mother, who has not seen it and doesn't know what we're talking about. And so...
You mean your mother hasn't got a t-shirt?
My niece has a t-shirt.
Shall I describe how it came about?
Yes, please.
Because I don't know if most museums on social media, they try to jump in these trends like it's International Cat Day or something, because they're just desperately clawing at some kind of relevance online. So they try and find something to platform on Cat Day. And I remember that day it was International Unicorn Day for some reason, which the Scottish have a lot of play with because it's their national animal.
Yeah.
And I thought maybe we could have found something in our collections, like a sheep with one horn growing out of its forehead, because that does happen every now and then. Like you get two-headed calves, that kind of thing. So as I was searching for sheep on the catalogue, instead I found this absolute unit pop-up. And it was like when you lock eyes with the person you know is going to be your lifelong partner from across the bar. I just immediately thought, that's a really good photo. And didn't think much of it, just posted it and said, look at this absolute unit. Mm-hmm. So to imagine a sheep, it's a very stocky, almost square sheep with a very thick coat. Curly horns?
Big curly horns.
From what I remember.
I think I described it as a Dorset horn. I think it's an Exmoor horn.
Yeah, it's Exmoor. Yeah. And it's black and white photo, not much going on in the background. It's obvious that's some sort of country fair. But it just takes front and center in the photo.
I mean, would it have been photographed because it won something, or just because it was at the show and it was an example of...
I think it was a prize winner. Yeah.
Well,
yeah. That's
quite great.
Yeah. Was it farmers and stock breeders?
I think it was farmer and stock breeder, yeah. So we hold two big press photographic archive collections at the museum connected to the farming press. One is the collection of Farmer and Stock Breeder, which is a publication that no longer exists, and the other one is Farmer.
I wonder why. Real page turn.
The other one is Farmers Weekly, which does exist and is still publishing weekly and has a big online presence. We don't hold those collections right up to present day, so that's an interesting thing. So Farmers Weekly, I think we have those holdings up to about the 1980s, but this photo I seem to remember was a 1960s one, early 1960s. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I've got 1967 in my head, but I can't remember why. But it definitely won something at the Dorset show, I think.
Yeah, 67's the Summer of Love, I think, isn't it? I don't know whether it was 1967.
It was a breeding round. So.
Anyway, so it would have won a prize, and photographic portraits like that would have been taken for sharing in the farming press by that stage, but it's picking up on a tradition that's much, much older, that's about, taking a prize animal and having a portrait painted of it, which might then be, reproduced in print media and therefore go viral in a sort of late 18th, early 19th century way.
But that did happen, didn't it? Like people had reproductions of prize wing animal portraits.
They did, which shows there's a long history to loving our farm animals in popular ways. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what happened? It went viral. Presumably that was. I remember being a little bit frightened by it. The prospect that things that we were doing through the medium of your incredible skill at social media might then have some capacity to reach vast numbers of people.
Well, you say it's got a lot of us just right time, right place with that kind of thing, and the sheep itself almost could stand by itself, I think. But I think we went from 10,000 followers to about 150,000 followers after the space of a few months off the back of that sheep.
Yeah, that is terrifying.
Set that in context for me. I mean, other museums, how many followers do they have?
We were the largest non-national museum on Twitter. So
in the UK?
In the UK.
Wow.
So the only people that had more followers than us were places like the British Museum or Tate or National Gallery, which I never stop reminding people of at conferences. And that's why everyone hates me. But I remember, I think I went to the loo and my phone just kept popping off. Our marketing manager, my boss, was on holiday, I think, on leave. So I just had to send her a text just being like, we're going viral, but I'm on top of it.
Was she by any chance in the Lake District? Because she does have a tendency. She has subsequently left the museum and she's moved to the Lake District. It seems suitable.
It does.
Appropriate.
Yeah,
but I think I felt better about it because it wasn't just being stupid with a meme, but because we had stuff to back it up. Because you see people going viral on social media now. You can click on their profiles and they have like 50 followers, even though they've got a post that has thousands, millions of likes. And I think what led to us actually getting the followers was because we had the depth to it. So I remember we knew immediately, this thing is kicking off. It may not last forever. How do we make this of value so people don't think we're just a stupid meme account? And that's when I got you to write that article about animal genetics. So explaining.
I have no recollection of that whatsoever.
Yeah,
it's probably the only thing I've written that's ever been read by.
We're digging into this. When you see a picture of that sheep, a lot of people are like, why is it so big? Right. So you did the blog saying, why is it this big? And it's because it was grown for the wool as well as the meat. So it had the insulation to survive on Exmoor. But it also had the meat that you could eat. So it's like a dual purpose.
You read whatever I wrote.
Yeah, it was great. Yeah. It was our most popular blog and probably still is. And then we sold T-shirts so that we got a bit of money back for the museum. We could delve into the archives, found the original photo, found the article in Farm and Stock Breeder. And
there was a nice history of layering and replication there, wasn't there? Because it wasn't just one photo.
So much media.
Yeah, there was the tweet reproduced, countless millions of times. There was the image on the blog, but then looking back in the tangible collections, there was a glass plate negative, I think. The print that would have been used to decide how to reproduce it in the publication. There was the image reproduced in the publication itself in a slightly grainier printed form. And then the museum retains the original catalogue cards from Farmer and Stock Breeder. So there was a tiny little copy print of it on one of those catalogue cards as well. So huge numbers of reproduced versions of exactly the same image that has proven so successful.
Not realizing back in the 60s, what is it like? My maths is terrible. Another 60 years on. Just imagining that farmer loving his sheep and not knowing it's going to have this extra resurrection and be loved by millions of people worldwide, which was really shocking to me because we had people from America. You got to imagine maybe you never left the USA, say, and you're going to Europe, you go to London, you're going to see all the sites, Big Ben, British Museum. And then you take one precious day out of that holiday. You may never come back to the UK. And you take the train to Reading, walk through the town centre to our medium-sized museum about rural life on the back of seeing an impressive sheep online.
That's one fine sheep.
And I still see people walking around Reading in the Morrisons wearing our T-shirt with the sheep on it. It just feels like those other examples we talked about with the mouse and the walking stick, they showed us what was possible. And then this really opened up not just our eyes, but I think other museums' eyes, that there was a way to actually talk to people online that they hadn't been trying before because they didn't think it's what museums did.
Yeah.
And there's ways of then making it educational and useful. But you've got to start with catching people's attention.
It's a bit like a shepherd. Really quick. getting hold of a misbehaving ewe, and
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who fully got hooked into this job, if you're wondering why there's an American on the podcast, it's because I'm one of the people who saw the tweet and was like, oh, this is great.
Yeah.
And followed the Twitter account, and then saw when Allison posted the job. And am here because this tweet exists, which is a weird thing to think about, because it's really easy to think of things happening online as separate from real life. And I think if this taught us anything, it's number one, only post animals. Number two, online life and real life are the same thing. I mean, all I can do is think about other animal posts that worked really well. I mean, you had the chicken and trousers that worked super well. Joe's been doing stuff with hogs that has been working super well. And I'm trying to figure out in my brain why we can't do the same thing with plows. I still have a dream that we're going to do a Valentine's Day card selection with all of our plows on them.
I feel like we should get into plows with Adam, actually, because I remember in terms of the curatorial input into the galleries, we all had galleries that we were responsible for. And I did a terribly navel-gazing one about the history of the museum and, institutional history. Everyone loves that. But I think you got lumbered with the joy of the wagons, and I think you became known as Wagon Man. But I think we also gave you the ploughs, and I think the ploughs were, that was a baptism of curatorial fire, and possibly, became a driving force behind why you ended up throwing your all into the socials and the digital rather than the curatorial practice.
I had to give myself motivational post-its on my desk that made me finish that gallery because it was so dull. But that goes back to why the sheep works, because some things I think can be adapted well to memes or what people find interesting online. Other things need a bit more love, I guess, and need a bit more attention paid to them. And that's where the museum galleries work, because people are locked in. They're in a museum. They're going to pay attention to the labels, more or less. They're going to digest a bit more of the information. Online, it's snappy.
Yeah.
Surefire. You can't do a whole gallery's worth of interpretation. You've got to catch that attention and then serve them the rest of the stuff. And I think that's what the sheep did. It's the look at me thing, where if we posted a plough, no one would have cared.
Yeah,
Scrolled on.
I think if we were doing that again, we might approach the ploughs differently. But most of that effort was about we had too many ploughs dotted around the galleries downstairs, and we wanted to pull them all out, shove them slightly out of the way upstairs, and then I think the best that we came up with was slapping a terrible pun, digging deeper on the gallery, because we were digging deeper into history in the open access stores on one hand, and then digging deeper into the sale with the ploughs on the other.
We tried to organise it geographically, something about the type of soil and the ploughs you need, and even as I say it, I feel myself falling asleep.
Well, you'll be pleased with the kind of no-till approaches to farming that seem to have us turning our back on the evil ploughs that caused you so much angst way back when.
Ditch the plough.
Yeah, we're not turning our back on the sheep, though. So thinking back to when you joined the museum, Adam, we were just coming to the end of a project called Collecting 20th Century Rural Cultures. What is it about museum projects and terrible titles? But that was a project that was trying to collect decade by decade to represent the 20th century in relation to the countryside. And the challenges there were about things were becoming too big and mechanized for the museum to have acquired them. And it was also about broadening the collections a bit into representations of rural life as much as things just made and used in rural contexts. And I think a lot of the redevelopment of the museum was built on the back of that. It was like, we've got all this new, quite colourful, cool stuff that resonates nostalgically and in powerful ways with lots of our audiences who recognise it, because it's not just an old plough, horror of horrors, but it might be a children's book or a piece of clothing or
tricycle
or a tricycle. Yeah. So things that really resonate powerfully and are popular. How does that speak to the connection with the digital and the way in which we engage and in a way are collecting through social media? Is there a legacy there, and is there a place for continued programs of contemporary or near contemporary collecting? Are they redundant?
I think so. I mean, we still live in the classic answer. Depends. We still live in a physical world. So, and a lot of what farmers do in particular is still very physical. But whereas before we might be relying on ephemera like pamphlets, leaflets, people's diaries, letters, that kind of thing, almost all of that now is digital. So when people are communicating, creating their own memes, creating their own leaflets, they're publishing those online. And I think the entire museums, archives, libraries are still trying to grapple with how do you capture this stuff and how do you make it more real? Is that more real if it's stored on a server and shown online? Is it more real if you print it off and stick it in a folder, which will probably give it more of a shelf life, to be honest? But when it came to collecting 20th century oral cultures, that was much more about the relevance, wasn't it? Because most of the collection in the museum is old, collected in the 50s, as everything was mechanizing and the old way of life was pretty much finally being taken out back and shot in the back of the head, I think. It was a big period of change, but because farmers hang on to things for so long, we still had stuff that had been 50, 100 years old, and they were still just eking some life out of it. And it was that shift from the countryside to a place of labour to a place of almost leisure to an extent. Because a lot of the stuff we got was people going back into the countryside and trying to ape the countryside feel. So we had like an Arga, didn't we?
I think we acquired the Arga for the displays.
Yeah.
So that's sort of building on the back of that same mode of collecting. We picked and we sort of selected a few things that we needed to fill gaps, didn't we?
I remember being told to find an Arga.
That was my fault, because actually I grew up in a farmhouse that had an Arga, and we used to put lambs in the warming oven to revive them when they were sort of weak and ailing, and I kind of wanted to capture that farmhouse experience. So, let's go out and get a Swedish object for the collection. Yeah. In fact, you also acquired a pair of welly boots for the collection, which were quite significant. We'll get onto that, but they were French welly boots, as I recall. So you were globalizing the collection, sneaking in a little bit of stuff from beyond the bounds of England. I like that.
Yeah, I can't remember what else I got. There's definitely something else, but those are the big ones.
Yeah, the wellies. What was significant about the wellies?
I remember we had a big chat about the wellies, because you could have gone just down the road to any farm in Berkshire and asked a farmer for his wellies.
And we didn't have any wellies, did we? Really bizarre gap in the collections. But
the thing with wellies is they're made to be working boots, but they're also a fashion item now, with like Hunters and other brands are available, I assume.
Le Chameau, in the case of those.
In the case of these ones. And that was driven in a large part by things like Glastonbury. And you have Kate Moss, other celebrities going to Glastonbury, wearing these wellies, being papped, and then other people buying wellies and wearing them around Chelsea, or dressing like a farmer to go to these kind of festivals to acquire the look for the weekend and then put them on a shelf for the rest of the year. Mm. So we thought, what if we got Michael Levis's wellies, the man who founded Glastonbury and only kind of recently retired, I think.
Yeah. So Michael Levis, for those who don't know, as well as founding Glastonbury, he's probably as well known in the dairy farming industry as a dairy farmer, really significant member of the farming community.
Yeah, when we spoke to him, I think he was the most profitable dairy farm in the country, which is not an easy thing to be.
No, it's very difficult to be profitable in dairy farming.
So I thought we'll probably never get to him if we just email Glastonbury. Because I was like, what are these weird people doing asking for wellies? So I found the number for his cheese farm and took the bet that would be an easier way of getting in touch with him, because not many people are probably going that route. I remember picking up the phone and asking, is Michael Levis down from the Museum of English Rural Life? He was like, yeah, I'm speaking. I didn't really know where to go with that, because he's a very down-to-earth man. He's a Quaker as well, I think, isn't he? Something like that.
I think so, yeah.
And I just said, well, can we have your wellies? We'd like to put them on display. And he was like, yeah, just come down. And then we took the car down to Somerset, and the pyramid stage was still in the fields. And he said, yeah, he just went inside, picked up his wellies off his shoe rack and gave them to us, and they still had the Glastonbury mud on them. So when we brought them back, the conservator preserved the mud in situ, because that's as much the mud of Glastonbury is as iconic as the wellies, I think.
Yeah, and our conservator is a big music fan as well, so I think secretly probably quite liked the fact that we had Michael Eavis's Willies.
Yeah.
I guess this picks up on that ongoing challenge that museums have, trying to represent and connect people to the past through things that they still recognise in the present. It comes back to that idea of people's stories and the way in which we try and hook people in with those sort of micro histories. Obviously, you're trying to do that online as well, through social media. But online, my sense is that different social media platforms are catering to very different audiences. This is my simple curatorial understanding of it, and that perhaps you might be getting quite nice focus groups in a way of different aspects of connection to the countryside. Animals obviously runs through those, but are there different ways in which those different platforms are working, and that we could glean more understanding and maybe learn more about how to connect people to these themes?
Well, one way is just by seeing what people are already talking about. But I think sometimes we assume that these platforms have tons of power, that you can only talk about certain topics because that's what everyone else is talking about, or doing videos in certain ways. But if anything, I think this is why Blue Sky is an interesting new one, because it's less algorithm focused. You've got more of a chance of showing up. I think these platforms have so much power of choosing what you see that sometimes people surprise them by what they are interested in. So you've seen more niche, weird content show up, where it can be tiny museums, people just doing things out in the countryside that people actually just love watching, like the therapeutic, just watching a sheepdog run across a field or something. And I think what people are interested in actually doesn't really change. It's just whatever's novel, whatever's interesting, something they can feel a bit of relevance to. And the way you present that might change sometimes, the way you pitch it. Some stories are more difficult than others, but people just want to have some sort of connection. And animals are easy for that.
Sorry to interrupt you. My drum that I bang all the time is that people go to museums online for the same reason they go in person. They want something interesting to look at. They want something they haven't seen before. They want something that has context and connection to their lives. And I think it's interesting to kind of think critically about where that exists online. We're talking a lot about social media. There are a lot of other digital projects that museums do to try to bring people into a more in-depth understanding of what they're working on, digitizing their catalogs, creating online exhibitions. And I know that there can often be worries about, if everything's online, then no one's going to go and see anything in person, which to me has always sounded insane, because I have never bought a CD. That shows you how old I am. I've never bought an album on streaming from a band I love and then thought, I'm not going to go to a show. Why would I go to a show? I've got the album already. And to me, that's the same dichotomy that you have in a museum's digital offer. But I did want to circle back to a point that, Ollie, I think you were making earlier about the ways in which we collect rural life and what kind of a museum we're going to be into the future, because we have had this shift between collecting the tools of rural life pre-mid-20th century into collecting ideas about rural life, like the Glastonbury wellies, or this giant straw sculpture we have called King Alfred, who is basically, what would you call him? A giant straw doll that's
He's a thatched figure.
Okay, I beg your pardon. That's a lot more
You could imagine him
elegant.
in the Wicker Man.
Yeah, exactly. But that's precisely the focal point for most people, right? Is the Wicker Man, which is a horror movie from the sort of 60s and 70s folk revival in Britain. And if you look at people who are actually living rural lives right now, a lot of them are in the global south, and a lot of them who are in Britain are already making their own content and speak for themselves, and working in video and showing people what it's like to be a dairy farmer, or what it's like to be someone who farms sheep or whatever. And I wonder in the future if we're going to have, do you think we have a role to play in preserving those stories, saving their TikToks on our servers? Is that what we're going to be? It's a left field question.
Well, it's strange because museums are used to physical collecting, because you can keep that forever. There are some places collecting online media, I think. It's a bit more complicated to do.
Yeah.
But I know the National Archive was archiving Twitter at one point, I think.
Yeah, I think they stopped because, oh my God, what a nightmare.
And and you both will know, of course, that the Science Museum have acquired the absolute unit tweet into their collection as a sort of digital asset item, live tweet. So that's an interesting thought experiment, isn't it? That you can take something that's out there on social media and acquire it in the same kind of vein and mode as you might a pair of wellies or a giant straw figure of King Alfred, and place it on display and allow it to play out, but in a living way. So this brings us to some quite interesting conceptual things about collecting in the UK today. We've just become signatories to the 2003 Convention on Intangible Cultural Heritage. So that brings into the fold the idea of living heritage, ongoing practiced skills, and quite tangible out there, active ways of living in the world. I've been having some conversations about that with people when it comes to farming. Farming plays a part in that context too. I think it falls under the domain of knowledge about nature and the universe, I guess.
Yeah.
But that's a bit of a stretch. But, farming is about understanding the natural world and extracting and exploiting from it. How do we collect and understand and think about forms of farming that perhaps have been historically harmful? Things to do with the ways in which we apply pesticides or fertilizers, things that might be about the ways in which we manage livestock, that we wouldn't manage livestock in that way today. Are there ways in which we can do that aren't about continuing to practice things in that vein? Is the social media world, the digital world, a way to capture some of that legacy and heritage, perhaps in a slightly more animate way than farmer and stock breeder was back in the day?
Well, I was thinking about the Argo and the Wellies, and they're almost like keystone objects, aren't they? They tell a much bigger story than just their materialness. And I think the same could apply to social media, that you're not trying to capture absolutely everything, but there might be particular individuals or particular posts or moments that do act to tell a wider story about a particular moment in time, protest or something like that. And I think we could be almost choosing potentially ambassadors like the Hurdy Shepherd, or doing a better job of saying, well, this big topic is happening, farmers are sharing this on their Facebook page. We should probably ask to take some of that and preserve it for the future, because otherwise it's all going to be lost in the rain. Like tears in the rain.
In the rain in Cumbria. Yeah. I mean, thinking about the Hurdy Shepherd, that's interesting. You mentioned him. That's James Rebanks, the writer and farmer. He's a Cumbrian hill farmer and farms Herdwick sheep. You mentioned him in your Tumblr posts about the shepherd's walking stick that we were talking about at the beginning of this podcast. You described him as having 60,000 followers on Twitter. He now has over 150,000 followers on Twitter, so he's about neck and neck with the museum in a way. But interestingly, very recently, I've been thinking about how we could capture and record and understand the farm protests, because the Collecting 20th Century Rural Cultures project acquired a car sticker about a decade and a bit after after the late 1990s protests that took place in Hyde Park and in London. There were really big, significant Countryside Alliance protests. So that's a decade later. All we could find as a museum to gather and collect that heritage was a car sticker that hadn't been stuck on a car, thankfully. So I thought, how do we do that? And the way to do that was to go online and go on social media and reach out to James Rebanks' wife, Helen Rebanks, who's also a writer and a farmer, and ask her in a barefaced fashion for the protest placard that she was making, that had made it onto the cover of the Farmer's Guardian and onto Farming Today, and had been talked about. So we have that in the collections now, but in a way it's that experience out there at the protest and those sort of lived experience of being in that space that are much more dynamic, and I think things that we can only capture through digital means.
that does it for this episode of Absolute Units. We'd like to thank Adam so much for being here. Where can people find out more about you and your work?
Well, I'm the only person, apart from a cousin in Scotland, called Adam Koszary in the world. So if you just Google me, you can find me. I now do social media for a living, so please pay me. I've got a dog to feed.
All right, sounds good. We'd also like to thank the Arts Council for making this show possible, as well as the Film, Television, and Theatre Department at the University of Reading. This show is a production of the Museum of English Rural Life as part of the University of Reading and Museums Partnership Reading. Thank you all so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.